was known in the courthouse as a man who never blinked. Judge Harold Kent, 62, had sat on the bench in Franklin County, Missouri for almost 3 decades. His white hair and stern demeanor made him look carved from marble, a figure of authority people respected and feared in equal measure. For years his sentences were quoted in the local paper. Justice must not only be served, it must be seen to be served. He was the kind of man who seemed incorruptible. And yet, behind the oak door of his private chambers, Harold Kent was slowly building a second life, one that mirrored the very crimes he condemned. It started quietly. He handled dozens of property and fraud cases each year. Somewhere around 2012, a foreclosure dispute landed in his courtroom, an older widow versus a real estate development firm. Kent ruled in favor of the developers. Days later, the developer's lawyer visited his home. A week after that, Kent's wife noticed a new deposit in their joint account, $30,000 marked consulting fee. The money sat there like a loaded gun. He told her it was from an old investment. She believed him because he had always been the one who believed in rules. Within a year, that single transaction became a habit. Developers, contractors, even bail bondsmen learned that Judge Kent had quiet preferences. His decisions began to tilt, not obviously, but enough that defense attorneys started whispering. One called it judicial gravity. Cases just seemed to fall in one direction when Kent presided. The local newspaper still hailed him as the Iron Gavel, a man known for harsh rulings against corruption. He sentenced a city treasurer to 8 years for embezzlement, telling him, "When those who hold power betray it, the system rots from within." The irony burned even as he spoke it. But power feeds on secrecy. By 2016, Kent had funneled nearly $500,000 in bribes through a shell company registered under his brother-in-law's name. He used it to remodel his home, buy a second property on Lake of the Ozarks, and keep a quiet mistress in St. Louis. His clerk, Dana, began noticing irregularities, sealed envelopes arriving on Fridays, long meetings behind closed doors, late-night calls from lawyers whose cases were pending. One night she found him burning papers in the courthouse fireplace. He said they were draft opinions. She nodded, but something in his tone made her uneasy. When the first whisper reached the FBI, it came not from a lawyer, but from a rival judge, a man who'd lost a promotion and wanted revenge. Still, the Bureau listened. Over 6 months, agents collected bank statements, intercepted calls, and quietly mapped a pattern. Every questionable ruling corresponded to a mysterious, consulting payment. They launched a covert sting. An undercover agent posed as a developer accused of bid rigging. He approached Kent with an envelope containing $10,000 and a request for leniency. Kent accepted. The cameras caught everything. When agents finally moved in, it was a gray morning in November. Kent had just finished breakfast. He was still in his robe when they knocked. The indictment listed 27 counts: bribery, fraud, obstruction of justice. The man who'd built a career on sentencing others to moral ruin now faced the same fate. The local press exploded. Judge Kent indicted on corruption charges. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse where he had once reigned. Former defendants wrote letters demanding retrials. One said, "He told me I'd betrayed the system. Now we see who really did." At trial, Kent's defense argued that he'd been entrapped, that years of public service had left him vulnerable, lonely, and bitter. But the evidence was airtight: wire transfers, recordings, witness testimony from his clerk. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, 14 years in federal prison. The same prison, ironically, where he had once sent others. They placed him in protective custody after an inmate recognized his face from an old newspaper photo. He spent his days reading legal briefs he could no longer influence. Dana visited him once. She said he looked smaller. Not physically, but in spirit. He told her, "I became the crime I thought I could control." She didn't respond. When she left, he stood behind the glass and whispered something she couldn't hear. Later, she learned it was a line he'd used in court years before. Justice isn't blind. It just refuses to look too closely at itself. The community changed after that. Every sentence he'd ever given was re-examined. Some convictions were overturned, others reaffirmed. But the trust, what once seemed unshakable, was gone. In Franklin County, people still lower their voices when they mention his name, because nothing unsettles a town like realizing the man who punished evil had been quietly practicing it himself. Judge Marianne Folsom was the kind of woman who seemed born for the robe. In Charleston, South Carolina, she was spoken of with reverence, sharp-minded, deeply religious, and unwavering in her interpretation of the law. Her courtroom was immaculate, her demeanor icy but controlled. For nearly 20 years, she handled some of the most violent cases in the county. She'd once told a reporter that, "Mercy belongs to God, not to the bench." The quote hung framed in the courthouse hallway. But what no one knew, not her colleagues, not the jurors who admired her composure, was that Marianne carried her own private sentence. It began with her husband, a retired naval officer whose drinking had turned their home into a battleground. She'd endured the shouting, the shattered glasses, the humiliations whispered in dark hallways. Her faith told her to endure. Her pride told her to control. And so she controlled everything, her court, her words, her face. Until one humid night in July 2015, when the control finally cracked. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. The couple lived in a colonial-style home on a quiet cul-de-sac. That night, Judge Folsom hosted a small dinner. Her sister, a friend from church, and her husband Richard. Wine, roast chicken, polite laughter. Around 10 p.m., the guests left. An hour later, a single call came through to 911. Marianne's voice was steady, calm. "My husband's fallen. He's not breathing." Paramedics arrived to find Richard lying at the bottom of the staircase, head fractured, blood pooling across the white tile. She was sitting on the steps, barefoot, her robe soaked in red. At first, it looked like a tragic accident. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible weapon. Marianne told police that Richard had been drinking heavily and stumbled. Her statement matched what they saw: broken glass, a toppled chair, an open bottle on the counter. The police took a brief statement and left. The death was ruled accidental pending toxicology. Marianne buried her husband quietly. The funeral drew half the legal community. She stood by the casket with perfect composure, even comforting others. But the cracks appeared quickly. A junior detective, working through the case file, noticed something odd. Richard's head wound was too clean. The angle didn't match a fall. The coroner's report showed 2 blunt impacts, not one. Quietly, a re-examination began. The detective secured a warrant to test the stair railing for residue. Under the 3rd step, they found faint traces of metal paint, matching the handle of a heavy fireplace poker. They returned to Marianne's house 2 weeks later. She was in the kitchen when they knocked. Wearing her black robe, she'd come home straight from court. They asked to search. She didn't protest. In the corner by the fireplace, the poker stood cleaned, polished, and slightly bent. When the lab confirmed microscopic blood traces, the case that had been closed reopened as homicide. The arrest made national news. Charleston judge charged with murdering husband. The story was surreal. The woman who'd sentenced dozens of men for domestic homicide now accused of one herself. She posted bail immediately, retreating to her sister's home. Her defense attorney, a man she'd once mentored, described her as a victim who finally broke. But the prosecution had a narrative sharper than any knife, a woman so obsessed with control that when her private life slipped out of her grasp, she corrected it permanently. The trial drew crowds that filled the courthouse steps. Marianne's face appeared on every channel. On the stand, she never cried. She said, "I did not kill my husband. I was afraid of him, but I did not kill him." Her voice didn't shake, but the jury watched her with something colder than doubt, curiosity, maybe even pity. The evidence stacked quietly, the blood patterns, the poker, a neighbor's report of shouting an hour before the 911 call. When the verdict came, she lowered her head only once, as if bowing to an inevitable verdict she'd written herself. Guilty, second-degree murder. Sentence, 25 years. In prison, the woman who once ruled the courtroom found herself teaching literacy classes to other inmates. She refused interviews. A journalist who sent her a letter received one line in reply: "I learned that justice does not end with conviction. Sometimes it begins there." Years later, former clerks still speak of her with conflicted awe. She believed the law was sacred, one said. But she forgot that truth doesn't wear a robe. The courthouse eventually removed her framed quote. In its place, they hung a simple plaque that read, "In remembrance of fairness, may it apply to all." Judge Raymond Ellis was a man whose voice could silence a room. For 25 years in Cincinnati, he presided over criminal cases with a kind of moral certainty that intimidated everyone around him. He spoke about integrity, about the burden of truth, about how justice was the last defense against chaos. Reporters described him as unshakably righteous. He sentenced men for fraud, perjury, bribery, crimes of deceit. He told one white-collar defendant, "Every lie has a cost and you've just paid it." The irony would come back years later, crushing him beneath its weight. It began small, as these things often do. In 2014, his only son Tyler was arrested for cocaine possession. The press covered it quietly. The judge's connections helped keep it off the front page. Tyler faced a possible year in county jail. Raymond panicked. His reputation had been built on the illusion of moral perfection. The idea that his own son would stand in the same dock where he'd condemned others, it was intolerable. He made a single phone call to an old prosecutor friend. The case was reassigned, evidence misplaced. Within weeks, charges were dropped for insufficient evidence. It should have ended there. But once a man learns he can bend the system, he rarely stops. Over the next few years, Ellis's interference became habitual. A cousin caught driving drunk, dismissed. A business associate facing tax charges, reduced to a fine. Each favor chipped a little more from the structure he'd sworn to protect. To keep the machinery quiet, he used his position to influence clerk assignments and trial schedules. He'd speak in riddles. Delay is mercy, and mercy serves the law, and those who owed him favors understood. By 2018, whispers circulated among courthouse staff. An investigative journalist named Amy Langley began to suspect something was off. She'd noticed that nearly every case involving the Ellis family ended in mysterious leniency. Her articles hinted at corruption, though she lacked proof. Then, in December of that year, she received an anonymous tip, a USB drive mailed in an unmarked envelope. On it were scanned court memos, sealed documents, and a spreadsheet listing over a dozen cases Judge Ellis had personally manipulated. Each entry was marked with a code: handled, delayed, nullified. The sender's identity was never revealed, but the evidence was undeniable. When the FBI approached the judge for questioning, he didn't panic. He'd been in that chair many times, asking others to swear their honesty. Now he sat across from the agents, hands folded, the faintest smile on his face. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I have always upheld the law." But when they showed him his own signature authorizing sealed deletions, the mask slipped. For the first time in decades, Raymond Ellis didn't have words. The arrest stunned the city. Local news anchors read the story with disbelief. Veteran judge accused of manipulating cases to protect family. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Lawyers who once revered him avoided eye contact. Every verdict he'd issued for a decade was placed under review. He resigned 2 days before the official suspension, but by then, his career was already dead. During the trial, the prosecution presented a devastating pattern. Ellis had interfered with 23 cases, directly altering outcomes or destroying evidence. Some defendants he'd helped were later arrested again, their victims confronting him in court. "You let him go," one woman said, trembling. "And he found me again." The judge's face remained still, but his eyes flickered with something close to grief. He had thought he was protecting his family, but in doing so, he had betrayed everyone else's. The sentence came swift: 10 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and tampering with public records. The courtroom was silent except for his breathing. As the bailiff led him away, he turned once toward the gallery, where his son sat alone. Their eyes met briefly. Tyler looked hollow, older than his years. Later, in an interview, he said, "He wanted to save me, but he killed everything that made him worth saving." In prison, Ellis became an object of fascination. Other inmates called him "Your Honor." Some mocked him. Others sought advice on appeals. He spent his time in the library, reading the same legal texts he once wielded as weapons. When asked by a journalist if he regretted what he'd done, he said only, "The law doesn't forgive, but it forgets quickly. I wish I could do either." By the time he was released, the courthouse had erased his nameplate, replaced his portrait with another's. Yet the ghost of his authority lingered in the halls, like the faint echo of a gavel struck too many times in pride. Judge Ellen Navarro built her reputation on her eyes, sharp, unblinking, the kind that seemed to pierce through every lie. In Miami's criminal court, defendants dreaded her courtroom. She was relentless, famous for dismantling alibis and calling out manipulation when she sensed it. "You can't charm justice," she'd once said to a man who tried smiling his way through a plea. The courtroom laughed then. They didn't laugh years later when they learned that she'd been the one doing the charming all along. It started with a man named Victor Salazar. He was a defense attorney, magnetic and dangerous in equal measure, known for defending drug traffickers and winning. They'd faced each other in court dozens of times, exchanging sharp words that bordered on flirtation. When their paths crossed at a private bar association dinner, the rivalry dissolved into something riskier. Witnesses would later say they disappeared together before dessert. No one thought much of it. Judges and lawyers had their social circles, their discreet friendships. But in Ellen's case, the line blurred fast. Victor began appearing in her courtroom more often. She handled the motions on his clients' cases. One afternoon, the bailiff noticed her ruling on an appeal she hadn't even read yet. When the paperwork surfaced, it favored Victor's client, one of Miami's most notorious cocaine distributors. She'd reduced the sentence from 15 years to 6. It seemed procedural at the time, a clerical interpretation of sentencing guidelines. Only later did investigators find out Victor had wired $40,000 to an offshore account belonging to Ellen's cousin. The affair deepened into something consuming. They met in hotels, exchanged burner phones, whispered about a future together. He promised her freedom. She promised him leverage. Together they turned the courtroom into theater. He'd argue passionately. She'd appear skeptical, then relent, every ruling precise, timed, believable. Over 2 years, nearly 9 of Victor's clients benefited from reduced sentences or favorable rulings. In return, Ellen received what looked like consulting fees, paid through a chain of dummy firms registered in Panama. It unraveled in a way neither expected. A DEA task force investigating Salazar's clients traced financial transactions to one of those shell companies. The company's listed consultant was Navarro. When agents realized it matched the judge's initials, the quiet investigation became a national scandal. The FBI installed surveillance near her chambers. They recorded her meeting Victor at a marina, embracing, exchanging a small black envelope. Within it, a check for $25,000. The morning of her arrest, Ellen still believed she could talk her way through it. She arrived at court in her navy robe, hair immaculate, eyes steady. The agents waited by her chambers. She paused when she saw them, smiled faintly, and said, "You're early for your hearing." When they told her she was under arrest for bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction, her hands didn't even shake. Only later, in the holding cell, did she begin to tremble. The trial was brutal. Every case she'd ever ruled on was scrutinized. Defense attorneys lined up to demand retrials. The press called her the siren judge. Some painted her as a woman seduced into corruption. Others said she was the architect of it. Victor cut a deal early, turning over records that proved the bribery scheme. His testimony sealed her fate. "She told me justice was flexible," he said on the stand, voice trembling. I believed her. The guilty verdict arrived after 5 hours of deliberation. 20 years. She didn't cry. As marshals led her away, reporters shouted questions about Victor. She didn't answer. Months later, in prison, she received a letter from him. Unopened, returned to sender. She was seen burning it in the courtyard trash barrel. Inside, Ellen kept to herself. She taught English to Spanish-speaking inmates and read legal thrillers late at night. One inmate said she used to repeat the same line over and over. "I sentenced liars for a living. I just never realized I was one of them." When her name came up years later, the courthouse staff spoke in quiet voices. "She was brilliant," a clerk said. And then she fell in love with the wrong kind of truth. Judge Thomas Brenner had the kind of presence that could make a courtroom feel smaller. Broad-shouldered, confident, with a deep voice that carried through wood-paneled halls, he was the pride of Tulsa County. A former Marine, he was known for his rigid moral code. He lectured young attorneys about duty, spoke at churches about redemption, and told every defendant the same thing before handing down a sentence: "You have to live with the truth." People admired that. They called him the conscience of Tulsa. But they didn't know that every sermon he gave was aimed at himself. In 2017, Brenner presided over a murder case that became the centerpiece of his reputation. A man named Corey Linton was accused of killing his wife after years of domestic abuse. The evidence was grim: blood-soaked clothes, text messages of threats, a witness who heard the fight. Brenner gave him life without parole, declaring that violence in the home is the purest form of cowardice. The crowd applauded as if justice had finally drawn a clean line. But in his own home, Behind neatly trimmed hedges and a manicured lawn, Brenner's world was a slow, private war. His wife Maria had been sick for years, neurological complications that left her often confused, unpredictable, sometimes violent in her outbursts. Brenner never spoke of it. He left the house each morning polished and silent, pretending his life was still orderly. But the pressure was building. Friends noticed his temper. He started drinking at lunch, a quiet bourbon before the afternoon docket. The man who once spoke about truth began avoiding mirrors. One winter evening, police were called to his house after a neighbor reported a single gunshot. They arrived to find Maria lying in bed, a bullet wound through her chest, and Brenner sitting beside her, his service pistol on the nightstand. He told them she'd been distraught, that she'd taken the gun herself. He sounded calm, rehearsed. The report read apparent suicide. They took his statement and left. The county prosecutor, one of his old protégés, handled the paperwork with unusual speed. The death was ruled self-inflicted. But rumors spread. A nurse from the local clinic told detectives Maria couldn't have fired a gun. Her hand tremors were too severe. Another neighbor said they'd heard shouting earlier that night. Then came the lab report. The gunpowder residue on Brenner's right hand. The angle of the shot inconsistent with suicide. Slowly, the story of the conscience of Tulsa began to decay. The investigation was quiet but relentless. 2 months later, the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation seized his computers and phone. Hidden in encrypted folders were journal entries, hundreds of them, where he detailed his resentment, his exhaustion, and his despair. In one entry, written a week before Maria's death, he wrote, "I sentence men for doing what I dream of." The arrest was televised live. He didn't resist. When reporters shouted questions as he was led out of his house, he only said, "Don't make her the villain." The trial became one of the most watched in state history. Prosecutors portrayed him as a man who'd decided he was above the law, capable of rewriting morality when it suited him. His defense argued compassion, that he'd been broken by years of caretaking and grief. But the jury only needed one look at the evidence, the journals, the residue, the contradictions in his 911 call. When the verdict came, guilty of second-degree murder, he didn't move. The courtroom was silent. The same prosecutor he'd once mentored asked the judge to show no mercy. The sentence was 40 years. As he was led away, a reporter caught him whispering, "The truth was never mine to give." In prison, Brenner became reclusive. He refused interviews, stopped attending chapel, stopped speaking at all. When a former clerk wrote to him asking what he thought about justice now, he replied with a single sentence, "It's just another name for self-deception." Years later, new judges came and went in Tulsa County, but his courtroom remained haunted. The wooden bench still bore a faint mark where his gavel used to strike. Lawyers swore they could still hear the echo on quiet afternoons, a hollow sound, like someone reminding himself that the truth can't be sentenced, only delayed. Judge Ellen Prescott never smiled in photographs. Every image of him, on courthouse walls, in bar association pamphlets, on awards night programs, captured the same expression. Cold, deliberate, as if smiling would dilute his authority. He presided over a district court in Portland, Oregon, known for being methodical and merciless. In sentencing hearings, he leaned forward, eyes narrow, voice low, speaking each word like a punishment in itself. "You thought you were above the law," he'd tell white-collar criminals. But the law remembers. For decades, that line defined him. Prosecutors adored him. Defense attorneys despised him. He was famous for one thing above all, his obsession with public integrity. He'd built his entire career on dismantling corruption. When a city councilman was convicted of embezzling funds, Prescott gave him 15 years without parole, saying, "Public trust is sacred. Break it once and you can never repair it." No one knew, as he said those words, that he'd been breaking that same trust in secret for years. The corruption wasn't financial, not at first. It was moral. It started with a quiet addiction. Alan Prescott, the man who condemned excess and vice, was an opioid user. It began after a car accident in 2010. Painkillers helped him recover. But once the prescriptions ended, the ache didn't. He began calling in favors from local pharmacists, using his authority to intimidate rather than request. He forged signatures, used false prescription pads, even leaned on clerks to dispose of evidence from narcotics cases so he could keep the pills. It might have remained hidden if not for a young bailiff named Ryan Holt. Ryan noticed things: a shaking hand during recess, a glassy stare during afternoon sessions, the way the judge began adjourning earlier each day. He also noticed that certain evidence lockers were being accessed without proper logs. One night, he followed Prescott to the courthouse after hours. From the shadows of the stairwell, he watched as the judge opened an evidence cabinet with a master key and slipped something into his coat. Ryan didn't confront him that night. Instead, he went to the state's Judicial Oversight Board. The investigation was delicate. Prescott was untouchable, or so everyone thought. For 6 months, Internal Affairs tracked him. They found that nearly 30 narcotics cases had lost their evidence before trial. Some of those cases collapsed because of it. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered: falsified medical reports, coded messages to pharmacists, untraceable cash payments. But the most damning detail wasn't the theft, it was the hypocrisy. One of his most publicized cases involved a doctor accused of illegally prescribing opioids for profit. Prescott had called the doctor a dealer in disguise and sentenced him to 12 years. The doctor wept as he left the courtroom. Years later, he would testify against Prescott. The day of his arrest, Allen was presiding over a fraud trial. Marshals entered the courtroom mid-session. The crowd froze as they read the warrant aloud. His gavel slipped from his hand and rolled across the bench. He tried to speak, but no sound came. For a man who'd spent his life judging others, the silence felt like a verdict of its own. The media devoured the story. Judge Prescott, the opioid hypocrite. His face filled every local station, a symbol of how even the self-righteous can rot from within. His defense team tried to argue medical dependency, pain, age. But prosecutors revealed the full scale of manipulation: altered records, destroyed exhibits, compromised verdicts. When sentencing day came, the irony was almost theatrical. The new judge read from a transcript of one of Prescott's old speeches about accountability, then handed him 11 years in federal prison. Inmates recognized him immediately. Some had been sentenced by him years before. One reportedly said, "Welcome to the other side of the bench, Judge." He lived in near isolation, never joining the cafeteria, rarely speaking. His cellmate later told reporters that he'd whisper in his sleep. It was supposed to help the pain. When he was released years later, he was nearly unrecognizable: thinner, hair white, eyes dim. He moved to a small coastal town and spent the rest of his life in anonymity, volunteering at a recovery clinic under an assumed name. No one there knew who he was. But every so often, when he handed a bottle of methadone to a trembling patient, he'd say quietly, "Don't let the cure become your sentence." Judge William Harrow wasn't just respected in Kentucky, he was revered. The son of a preacher and a schoolteacher, he'd built his career on discipline, humility, and the belief that law was a form of divine order. He was tall, slow-spoken, with a voice that made juries lean forward. Reporters called him the preacher judge. He quoted scripture in court, not out of piety, but as punctuation to his rulings. "The truth will set you free," he'd often say, just before sending someone to prison. For decades, no one questioned him, until the truth finally came for him, and there was nowhere left to hide. In 2019, Judge Harrow presided over a notorious domestic abuse case. A man named Leonard Briggs had been charged with assaulting his wife so severely she nearly lost an eye. The case was open and shut. But in court, Harrow took an unusually soft tone. He questioned the victim's credibility, reduced the charges, and allowed Briggs to walk free with a suspended sentence. The ruling outraged women's rights groups. Local activists flooded the courthouse steps. But Harrow stood by his decision, saying, redemption must always be an option. It wasn't mercy. It was guilt. Behind closed doors, Harrow was living his own double life. He'd been having an affair with a courtroom clerk named Dana Wyatt for nearly 5 years. She was half his age, ambitious, and quietly terrified of him. To everyone else, she seemed like his shadow, always nearby, always quiet. No one knew that their relationship had turned violent. It started with jealousy. She'd mentioned a former boyfriend one night, and Harrow slapped her across the face. The next morning, he apologized with flowers and cash. But the cycle deepened. Control, apology, control again. Dana tried to leave once. He threatened to ruin her career, even hinted that he could have her charged for evidence tampering. The power dynamic between them became a prison. When she started secretly recording their arguments, it wasn't for revenge, it was for survival. In one of those recordings, later played for the jury, Harrow's voice could be heard saying, No one will ever believe you over me. In late 2021, after a particularly violent night, Dana showed up at the ER with bruises and a broken rib. She told the nurse she'd fallen, but the staff knew better. They called police. When officers arrived, they were stunned to find her shaking, whispering the judge's name. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Judge William Harrow accused of domestic assault. The fallout was seismic. For weeks, Harrow denied everything. His lawyers dismissed the claims as vindictive lies from a disgruntled employee. But then the recording surfaced. Every local station played the audio, his voice calm and cruel, saying, "If I lose you, I'll destroy you." The entire state watched the collapse in slow motion. He was arrested while leaving Sunday service. Cameras followed him as he was led away in handcuffs, Bible still in his hand. During the trial, he sat silent while prosecutors read the transcripts of his own abuse. His defense tried to paint him as a man unraveling under stress, but the evidence was devastating. Photos, medical reports, the tapes. When Dana took the stand, she didn't cry. She simply said, "He told me redemption was for everyone but him." The jury took less than a day. Guilty on all counts. 7 years for assault, 2 for coercion, plus a lifetime ban from the bench. In prison, the preacher judge became a cautionary tale. Inmates called him Father Law. Some mocked him. Others sought confessions. He spent his time reading scripture and writing letters to victims of domestic abuse, as if preaching could undo what he'd done. One of his final letters, leaked after his death in custody, read, "I spent my life sentencing men who looked like me." I should have recognized the reflection. The courthouse replaced his chair but kept his gavel on display, cracked down the middle, a symbol of authority divided by its own hand. Judge Marianne Keller of Minnesota had always been described as unshakable. She was the kind of judge who could stare down a murderer without blinking, who never once raised her voice in decades on the bench. People admired her restraint, her quiet, methodical control over every courtroom she stepped into. But behind that composure was something colder. A woman who had built her authority on suppressing emotion until it warped into something she couldn't contain anymore. For years, Judge Keller had presided over financial crime cases: fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. She was known for her disdain toward white-collar criminals. "You don't need a gun to ruin lives," she once said, sentencing a hedge fund manager to 20 years. The courtroom applauded that day. She was righteous, principled, incorruptible. At least that was the image she crafted. What no one knew was that her own finances were collapsing. Her husband had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, and his treatment drained their savings. Insurance barely covered half of it. The Kellers had a daughter in college, and the tuition notices kept coming. For a while, Marianne managed to keep up appearances. Second mortgage, personal loans, credit lines quietly maxed. Then the notices turned red, and desperation started whispering to her in the very courtroom where she once demanded honesty. It started with a small favor. A defense attorney named Paul Merrick, someone she'd known for years, approached her privately after a hearing. "You've helped me win plenty of cases," he said with a smirk. "Maybe it's time I helped you." He offered her a consulting fee, $5,000, in exchange for leniency on a client. She refused, at least the first time. But the second time, when the hospital sent another urgent bill and her daughter called crying about tuition, she called Merrick back. 5,000 became 10, then 20. Each time, the exchange was cleaner, quieter. She told herself she was borrowing, that she'd pay it back once her husband's estate settled. But it wasn't a loan. It was the beginning of a system. By 2018, Judge Keller had accepted over $180,000 in bribes through a network of consultants. She modified sentences, delayed warrants, even dismissed key evidence in exchange for payments funneled through shell firms. Her rulings remained outwardly precise, her demeanor unchanged. The corruption might have stayed buried if not for one case. A young accountant named Clara Jenkins was charged with embezzling funds from a nonprofit for cancer patients. The evidence was strong, but Keller shocked everyone by dismissing the charges entirely, citing procedural irregularities. The prosecutor, suspicious of her wording, filed an appeal, and then, quietly, contacted the FBI. What the Bureau found was a trail of coded payments that pointed straight to Keller's accounts, transfers disguised as consulting retainers, withdrawals that coincided perfectly with controversial rulings. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. a meticulous judge whose ethics were collapsing in slow motion. In 2020, federal agents raided her home. They found ledgers, burner phones, and handwritten notes referencing case numbers and payout amounts. Her husband, confused by the intrusion, asked the agents, "Is this about her work?" It was one of the few moments that broke her. She reportedly cried for the first time in years. During the trial, the courtroom she once ruled over became her cage. She refused a plea deal, insisting she'd been coerced. But the recordings were clear. Hours of phone conversations with Merrick, discussing adjustments to sentencing in exchange for donations. The jurors stared at her as if she were a ghost of the person they'd once respected. When the verdict was read, guilty on 8 counts of bribery, fraud, and obstruction, she didn't react. The same unreadable calm she'd shown defendants now masked her own collapse. The judge who replaced her read the sentence she once gave others: 10 years in federal prison. In the correctional facility, she was placed in administrative isolation for her safety. Other inmates recognized her face from old televised cases. Some mocked her. One even called out, "You can't sentence us anymore, Your Honor." Her husband passed away during her second year inside. The news reached her during mail call. Witnesses said she didn't cry, didn't speak, just folded the letter and held it to her chest. Before her release, she gave one interview. Her voice was soft, her words precise as always. "I spent my life condemning greed as if it were something I could never feel. But desperation sounds just like righteousness when you're convincing yourself." The courthouse where she once presided still has her name etched on a brass plaque, a reminder of justice turned inward, until the gavel fell on the one who wielded it. Judge Anthony Del Vecchio was the kind of man who thrived on being feared. In New Jersey's criminal courts, his name carried a certain finality. If your case landed in his courtroom, there was no mercy coming. His reputation was built on precision and punishment. "If you've done the crime," he once told a courtroom full of reporters, "you'll wish you hadn't when I'm done with you." He was meticulous. Black suits, silver tie clips, the same fountain pen for every signature. His chambers were immaculate, decorated with framed headlines of his most famous cases. To the public, he was the personification of order. To the people who worked beneath him, he was an intimidating tyrant. But that image of control was hiding something rotten underneath, a secret addiction that would ultimately turn him into the kind of criminal he'd spent decades condemning. It began quietly, years earlier, after a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light, slamming into Del Vecchio's SUV. He walked away with fractured ribs and chronic pain that never truly faded. At first, he followed his doctor's instructions. Oxycodone, then Percocet. But the pills became a crutch, then a need, then something darker. When his prescription ran out, he found ways to get more, first through acquaintances, then through a local pharmacist who owed him favors. By 2015, he was fully addicted, hiding his dependency behind long court sessions and late nights at chambers. His clerks began noticing small changes: slurred speech, shaking hands, unpredictable bursts of anger. He'd nod off during hearings, then suddenly snap awake with fury. Still, no one confronted him. He was Judge Del Vecchio, untouchable, terrifying. Then came the night that everything unraveled. It started with an overdose victim found behind a grocery store, a young man whose dealer had been supplying prescription pills through stolen hospital pads. During the investigation, police traced the illegal supply chain back to an unexpected name: a local pharmacist who had been exchanging drugs for cash and favors. When they raided the pharmacist's home, they found envelopes, each labeled with initials, dates, and payment amounts. One of those envelopes read, AD 1002, signed off. When investigators ran the initials, they thought it couldn't be possible. But within days, they discovered what signed off meant. Del Vecchio had allegedly signed judicial orders reducing sentencing or granting leniency to low-level offenders tied to the dealer's network. In exchange, he'd received pills, not money, just the thing that now ruled his life. The FBI began a quiet inquiry, wiretapping the pharmacist's phone. It didn't take long before Del Vecchio's voice appeared, calm and deliberate, arranging a meeting off-record. He'd fallen into the same trap as many of the criminals he'd sentenced, trying to rationalize his crime as necessity. "You don't understand," he said during one call later used as evidence. "I need it to function. I'm not buying it to sell." When the story broke, the legal community was stunned. The headlines read like satire: "Judge accused of trading justice for painkillers." Del Vecchio denied everything. He claimed he was being blackmailed, that the recordings were taken out of context. But the evidence kept stacking up. Transaction logs, text messages, surveillance footage showing him meeting the pharmacist behind a diner in the middle of the night. When the federal indictment came, he walked into the courthouse not as a judge but as a defendant. The irony was unbearable. The same marble steps he once climbed in authority now echoed with the sound of his shackled ankles. In court he looked frail, shaking from withdrawal. His attorney painted a portrait of a man trapped by chronic pain, arguing addiction was an illness, not corruption. But the prosecution countered with a single devastating point. He didn't just feed his addiction. He corrupted the system to sustain it. He was found guilty on charges of bribery, obstruction, and possession with intent to distribute. Sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 5. In prison, Del Vecchio refused to speak to the press. Inmates reportedly avoided him. The irony of a judge among convicts was too bitter to bear. He spent most of his days in the infirmary wing, detoxing and writing letters that were never sent. One correctional officer recalled finding a notebook in his cell filled with shaky handwriting. Justice is not blind. It just looks away when it sees itself in the mirror. After serving 4 years, he was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. The guard said he'd left his gavel from home on the bunk beside him, as if reminding himself who he once was. When the prison chaplain was asked about his final days, he said something that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. He couldn't live without judgment, even when the only one left to judge was himself. Judge Ellen Navarro was the kind of person everyone in Washington, D.C. wanted to impress. She'd graduated top of her class at Yale, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and by 45 was one of the youngest federal judges in the country. In photos, she always looked composed. Pearl earrings, hair in a tight chignon, eyes that didn't blink even under the flash of cameras. Her rulings were famous for their precision, her reputation for being incorruptible, almost mythic. To the outside world, she embodied integrity, but beneath that immaculate image was a secret obsession, not with power, but with control. She'd grown up in a household where perfection was survival. Her father, a military officer, demanded order. Her mother, a failed pianist, demanded excellence. Helen carried that hunger for approval into adulthood. Every verdict she issued, every sentence she read aloud, was another brick in a fortress she'd built to keep her flaws hidden. Until one of those flaws began to consume her completely. It started with her brother. Thomas Marbury was her opposite, reckless, charming, a gambler who'd squandered their family's inheritance. Helen hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade when he showed up at her chambers one evening, pale and shaking. He owed a local bookmaker over $200,000. "They're going to kill me, Helen," he whispered. She told him to go to the police. But when he said the bookmaker's name, her stomach dropped. It was a man she'd recently sentenced, Vincent Morelli, a mid-level crime boss who ran an illegal betting ring. His conviction had been overturned on appeal due to procedural error. Helen had signed off on the retrial. Within a week, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photo of her brother, bruised and terrified, tied to a chair. The message was simple. You want him back? Fix it. Helen faced an impossible choice, uphold the law or save her brother's life. She chose family. At first, she tried to convince herself she could do it without anyone noticing. She began influencing the retrial quietly, manipulating the jury pool, leaking details to defense counsel through intermediaries. Her actions were surgical, careful. The verdict came back not guilty. Her brother was released the next day. She thought it was over. But Morelli wasn't done. He knew what he had. A federal judge who could be controlled. He began sending new requests. Delay this hearing. Suppress that evidence. Make this witness disappear. Each demand came with another threat, another photo, another reminder that he owned her. Within 2 years, Judge Marbury had become an invisible player in organized crime. She was passing information about ongoing investigations, tipping off suspects before raids, and signing judicial orders to protect criminal fronts. She kept it all compartmentalized, a hidden life behind the walls of her courtroom. It was an FBI wiretap that finally brought her down. Agents investigating Morelli recorded a phone call in which he bragged, "Even the judge is one of us." The Bureau launched a secret operation, tailing everyone in Morelli's circle. What they uncovered stunned them. Court files altered, witness statements redacted, rulings rewritten after hours by the judge herself. They arrested Morelli first, hoping to catch him off guard. In custody, he panicked. To save himself, he offered everything: recordings, emails, even photos of him meeting Helen in a restaurant parking lot. One image showed her handing over a sealed envelope. When agents arrived at her home, she didn't resist. She just asked one question: "Is my brother safe?" During the trial, her defense argued coercion, that she'd been blackmailed, manipulated through fear. But prosecutors painted her as a willing accomplice who'd chosen to protect a criminal network rather than report it. The jury's verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts of conspiracy, obstruction, and aiding organized crime. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Her brother, racked with guilt, testified at her sentencing hearing. He broke down on the stand, saying, "She did it because she loved me." Helen didn't look at him once. In prison, she became a ghost, refusing interviews, avoiding contact, spending most of her time in the library. Inmates nicknamed her the Judge of Silence. The press called her case the Fall of Justice. Years later, when a journalist finally managed to speak with her through correspondence, she sent one short letter. It read, "The law is supposed to be blind, but love is blind first." Her gavel, once a symbol of absolute control, now sits in an evidence locker marked as Exhibit 47. Judge Raymond Vance was a relic of a different era, a man who believed justice was about fear. His courtroom in rural Alabama was legendary for its severity. He wore his black robe like armor, his voice steady and cruelly calm. No one interrupted him. No one questioned his rulings. If you stood before Judge Vance, you prayed for mercy that would never come. He'd grown up in the same county he now ruled from the bench, the son of a sheriff and a devout Baptist mother. Discipline wasn't just a principle in his home, it was law. As a young prosecutor, Vance built his career on one mantra: a broken hand heals, a broken law does not. Over the years, that belief hardened into something else, not justice but punishment for its own sake. In 2012, his name started surfacing in whispers. Defense attorneys noticed a pattern. Vance had been unusually lenient in cases involving certain repeat offenders, all tied to one local bail bondsman named Chester Locke. Locke was a former deputy-turned-businessman, known for his ability to get people out of jail within hours. He was also one of Vance's oldest friends. Their connection went back decades. Locke had helped fund Vance's first campaign for district judge. In return, Locke's clients always seemed to catch a break: reduced sentences, lighter fines, sometimes even dismissals on technicalities. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you looked closely, but one defense lawyer did. Her name was Carla Denson, a public defender who'd spent years watching Vance humiliate her clients. When one of her defendants, a man caught with a stolen truck, received a suspiciously favorable ruling, she decided to dig deeper. Court records revealed a pattern of at least 20 cases where Locke's clients received inexplicable leniency. She filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board. At first, nothing happened. Then her car was vandalized outside her office, and she began receiving anonymous calls at night. She didn't back down. In 2016, a journalist from the Montgomery Ledger picked up her story. Within months, a joint investigation by state and federal authorities was underway. They uncovered financial records showing that Judge Vance had been receiving consulting payments from Locke's company for over 10 years, over $400,000 in total. The money was disguised as real estate income, filtered through a shell corporation registered under his wife's name. When federal agents showed up at his home, Vance didn't even deny it. "You think you're the first to get paid for doing your job?" he said. His arrogance shocked investigators. But what truly stunned them was how far it went. He hadn't just taken bribes. He'd used his authority to extort. In exchange for favorable rulings, he demanded money, gifts, even property from defendants' families. Some had sold their cars and homes to earn mercy. The scandal exploded in the press. Local residents who'd once seen him as a moral pillar now called for his resignation. But Vance refused. "You can't judge the judge," he said to reporters as he entered the courthouse for what would be his final hearing. During the trial, his cold demeanor began to crack. Witness after witness testified. Families who'd paid cash to his intermediaries, lawyers pressured into compliance, even Locke himself, who turned state's evidence to save his own sentence. When the prosecution presented the ledger, handwritten entries showing payments, case numbers, and initials. Vance's face went pale. For the first time, the man who never flinched looked afraid. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on counts of extortion, bribery, and racketeering. The sentence was brutal, 25 years without parole. The same prison system where he'd sent thousands of others would now house him. Inmates recognized him immediately. Some shouted his name in mock trials across the cafeteria. Others avoided him entirely. The guards said he spent his days reading the Bible and writing long letters that no one ever received. When asked why he'd done it, he gave the same answer every time. Because everyone has a price. Even God collects tithes. He died behind bars at 74, of a heart attack in his cell. The local church refused to host his funeral. Only his estranged daughter attended the burial. On his gravestone there was no mention of his title, just his name and the words, "Judge me not." Judge Evelyn Cross was a name whispered with reverence across the Midwest. She was known for her empathy, her eloquence, her almost poetic way of speaking about justice. She once said during a sentencing, "The law isn't just about punishment, it's about healing what's been broken." Reporters loved her. Law schools invited her to speak. Young attorneys quoted her in their graduation speeches. But that image, gentle, wise, unshakably moral, was a mask she had crafted from guilt. Because long before she ever took the bench, Evelyn had committed a crime she never paid for. In the late 1990s, before her judicial career began, Evelyn had been a young assistant district attorney in St. Louis. Bright, idealistic, desperate to prove herself, she became fixated on a murder case involving a 19-year-old accused of killing a store clerk during a robbery gone wrong. The evidence was thin, one shaky eyewitness and a fingerprint on a surface that could have been touched days before. But the media wanted a conviction, the department wanted a win, and Evelyn wanted to make a name for herself. She buried evidence that didn't fit the narrative. A security camera from across the street showed another suspect, a man who resembled the defendant but wasn't him. She hid it, labeling it inconclusive. The young man, Darren Wallace, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Evelyn's career took off like a rocket. Within 10 years, she was a judge. Within 15, she was a legend. And she told herself it had been the right call. For a while. Then, 23 years later, a nonprofit organization dedicated to wrongful convictions uncovered the hidden footage. The real killer, long dead, was identified. Darren Wallace had spent more than 2 decades behind bars for a murder he never committed. The story made national headlines. New evidence frees man convicted in 1998 murder case. When Evelyn saw his face on the news, older, frail, eyes hollowed by years of confinement, she stopped breathing. No one else knew she'd been the prosecutor. She thought about confessing, but she didn't. Instead, she invited him to her courtroom 6 months later, when he sued the state for wrongful imprisonment. He didn't recognize her, or maybe he did and didn't care. During the proceedings, Evelyn watched him speak about the lost years, the family he never got to see, the life that was taken from him. Each word carved into her like a blade. She ruled in his favor, awarding him millions in damages. And then she went home and drank herself sick. Her guilt became an obsession. She started reviewing her old cases, terrified she'd find more ghosts. And then one night she did. A pattern. Another defendant. Another suppressed report. Another missing tape. She realized the rot wasn't in the system. It was in her. By the time federal investigators came knocking, she already knew why they were there. An anonymous letter had been sent to the Department of Justice, attaching copies of her old case files, including the altered evidence logs. The letter was unsigned. Some believed it was written by her clerk. Others suspected she sent it herself. She was charged with obstruction of justice, perjury, and falsifying evidence. It was the first time in the state's history that a sitting judge faced criminal charges for a crime committed as a prosecutor. The same courthouse where she'd once preached compassion now echoed with her own condemnation. During the trial, she didn't defend herself. She pled guilty. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she simply replied, "Every sentence I ever gave was a mirror I refused to look into." She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Darren Wallace, her former victim, was in the audience. He didn't stand, didn't speak. He just watched her being led away in handcuffs. In prison, she taught other inmates how to file appeals, how to write legal briefs, how to understand the system that had failed them. She became what she once pretended to be, compassionate, human, flawed, but honest. When she was released, she disappeared from public life. No one knew where she went until a journalist found her years later, volunteering at a halfway house for women recently released from prison. When asked why she did it, she said softly, "Because justice doesn't end in court. Sometimes it starts after the sentence." She never reapplied for her law license. The plaque that once hung in her office, a gift from her first clerk, still sits in that halfway house's office. The words engraved on it read, "May the law always heal." But everyone who sees it knows the truth. It's not a reminder of what justice is. It's a memorial to what it cost her to find it. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Where trust ends, the crime begins. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.